Okay, Luke chapter 20. Luke chapter 20. I want to go back to, I guess all the way up to verse 27. We read beyond that, but I want to look at one thing here. Let's see, that may not be it. Where was it? And then Yeah, all the way up to 20, verse 20. Luke 20, verse 20. And they watched him and sent forth spies, which should feign themselves just men, that they might take hold of his words, so they might deliver him unto the power and authority of the governor. And then in verse 21 it says, And they asked him, saying, Master, we know that thou sayest and teachest rightly, neither acceptest thou any person of any, but teachest the way of God truly. Is it lawful for us to give tribute unto Caesar or not? So there were these men who feigned, they acted like they respected him. They acted like they were righteous. They acted like he was a great teacher, and they flattered him with words that they didn't believe. They said, we know you teach rightly, and then they try to get him in a trap where they can take his words and have cause to bring him before the governor because they want to get rid of him. So then, they ask about that giving to Caesar, and of course Jesus answers saying, look at the coin. Whose inscription is on it? Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Render unto God that which is God's. And of course, God made us in his image. And so we have the inscription of God on us. So we are to render our lives unto Caesar. And Jesus, he's not, they kept thinking, even his own disciples kept thinking that he was bringing about an earthly kingdom. Nicodemus, when he met him by night, was thinking he was bringing about an earthly kingdom. And Jesus kept saying, it's not, there's the flesh and the spirit, and I'm dealing with the spirit. And so they're trying to find these ways, and they thought maybe he would say, you can't pay taxes because you belong to God. Jesus, he said, pay your taxes, but give your bodies to Christ, to God. And then, we go down a little further, I guess verse 27 now. Then came to him certain of the Sadducees, which deny that there is any resurrection. And they asked him, saying, Master, Moses wrote unto us, if any man's brother die, having a wife, and he die without children, that his brother should take his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. And we went over this last week. So they're saying, what if there were 7 brothers and they all die, they marry this woman, they all die without children, and she becomes each one's wife. Whose will she be in the resurrection? Trying to get Jesus caught in a they must have thought that this was a real good proof that there is no resurrection. I mean, they probably brought their best argument. They thought, and among themselves, maybe they had discussions and said, the idea of a resurrection is ridiculous because even look in the law, you have this situation. So they go and they ask Jesus this question, trying to trip him up and trying to find a way to say that there is no resurrection or prove their point. And Jesus just answers, he says, in heaven it's not like that. There is no marrying or giving in marriage in heaven. So your whole question is irrelevant. She'll be no one's wife in heaven. But there is indeed a resurrection. That's why God is called the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When God met with Moses, he said, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Did I say Joseph the first time? Yeah. Jacob. Joseph too, but that's not how he called himself. So those men, by the time Moses was at the burning bush, those men had died in the flesh, of course. But God still says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so they're still, though they died on earth in the flesh, they're still alive. And God is the God of the living. We can read that. Let's go to verse 34. And Jesus answering unto them, said unto them, the children of this world marry and are given in marriage, but they which be accounted worthy to obtain that world and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Neither can they die anymore, for they are equal unto the angels and are the children of God, being the children of the resurrection. Now that the dead are raised, even Moses showed at the bush when he called the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. For he is not a God of the dead, but of the living, for all live unto him. So he answers them once again in a way that, most of the time Jesus answers in an unexpected way. He'll either answer with a question that someone can't answer, or it seems like he always comes, from the left or from the right. He comes at an angle that I'm not expecting when I read, and no doubt they weren't expecting. But he says there isn't marriage in heaven like that. But let me tell you why the Bible supports, or the Old Testament supports, a resurrection. So he brings truth to these Sadducees who have no belief in the resurrection. Now look at what happens. Verse 39. Then certain of the scribes answering said, Master, thou hast well said. And after that, they durst not ask him any questions at all. So the scribes, now keep in mind, way back to verse 20, and they watched him and sent forth spies which should feign themselves just men, that they might take hold of his words, so they might deliver him unto the power and authority of the governor. So even these scribes, thou hast well said. You got the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, they're all out to get Jesus. And they say, you've said well, and they thought, let's quit asking him questions. Because when we ask questions, it does not turn out how we thought. We don't get anything where we can take him to the governor. And in fact, a lot of the people around hear him making us look like idiots. So let's stop that tactic. It's not working. So they quit asking him questions, but look at verse 41, Luke 20, verse 41. And he said unto them, how say they that Christ is David's son? They didn't have to ask him another question. He's going to keep on. He's going to tell them some more. And again, this is, proving life after death. And Christ before birth. It shows both. So, how say they that Christ is David's son? So he first asks, how do they say Christ is David's son? Well, it does say that Messiah would come from the root of Jesse, that Messiah would be a son of David. Messiah would reign from David's throne. There are a lot of verses in the Old Testament that discuss Messiah being a son of David. And remember when Jesus was walking through town, and I think it was Bartimaeus, says, Jesus, thou son of David, recognizing him, Messiah, the way that they all commonly understood, son of David. So Jesus says, how say they that Christ is David's son? And David himself saith in the book of Psalms, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou on my right hand, till I make thine enemies thy footstool. David therefore called him Lord. How is he then his son? So Jesus isn't going to let it go. He's going to first talk about Moses and him referencing the God of those who appeared dead but are still living. Now he talks about David calling, it's kind of like Yahweh said to Adonai, they're both God, but it's the Father speaking to the Son. Sit at my, let me read it again. I don't want to mess it up. 42. Sit thou on my right hand till I make thine enemies thy footstool. So David, we know that Messiah is a son of David, and yet David is calling him Lord even in his day. Yahweh said to my Lord. So, in other words, the Messiah existed. There's God, there's Messiah, the Son, existed during David's time, just not on earth yet. So, and then when he comes to earth, he's after David and yet is preferred before him. He is the Lord. And so, and David also is still living. David died, but yet his soul lives on. And so Jesus, in two different ways, supports the idea of a resurrection, a life after death, and a life before birth for Jesus, for the Messiah, for the Son. So he asks that, and we don't see any answers. We don't see if there was any response from the scribes at all. But look at this, what he says in verse 45. Then in the audience of all the people, he said unto his disciples, beware of the scribes which desire to walk in long robes and love greetings in the markets and the highest seats in the synagogues and the chief rooms at feasts, which devour widows' houses and for a show make long prayers, the same shall receive greater damnation. Can you imagine? He's just been talking to the scribes. And he gives this question that we don't see anyone answer. And he turns to his disciples. His 12 are there, along with scribes, Sadducees. And he says, beware. And, can you imagine this morning, me reading these verses and then looking up and looking at you and saying, beware of those Conleys. Amen. They're right here. And Jesus says, right in the presence of them all. There's Sadducees. There are his disciples. There are people questioning. Jews that are of low estate. There might be publicans still there. There might be maimed and lame. I don't know. But he tells his disciple, now he's always concerned about his disciples foremost, right? He wants those who follow him, they get the most teaching. But he says to him, beware of the scribes. They wear I wonder if they had the long robes on right there and people looked. You know, can you imagine? Can you imagine the scribes, how they felt? And they wear these long robes, and look what he says about them. They desire to walk in long robes and love greetings in the markets. They might have just walked through markets to get there. You know, and having everyone, oh, hello, you know, and oh, look, a scribe is among us. And they love that kind of adoration. And Jesus knows their hearts. He knows what they love. And, yes?
And that was right after they had kind of tried to smooth it over and say, oh, you did really
well. Oh, yeah, you taught well.
Yeah, you did well. And so then...
Yes.
Okay.
And they love the highest seats in the synagogues and the chief rooms at feasts. You know, Matthew had a big feast. I think it was the very night he got called to follow Jesus. Matthew was sitting at the customs booth, the tax office, if you will, collecting taxes, people hating him. And he's rich, but he's rich because he's been taking people's money. He takes their money, gives some to Rome, and then lives off the rest. And he is hated. And he had a feast. And you know, the publicans didn't get invited to feasts. If someone had a feast, the publicans were not welcome. And so, but Matthew had a feast that night, and he invited other publicans. He invited other outcasts. And Jesus went and took his disciples to that feast. You know, the scribes wouldn't be caught dead in that feast. If they had passed by while Matthew was having a feast, they might have looked in. They might have wondered, what's all this commotion at Matthew's house? But they would not have gone in. So they love the very best seats at the very best feasts. They're in the best room. They're right up next to the host every time there's a feast. And Jesus says they love that. But they devour widows' houses. And for a show, make long prayers. So they're the ones that are standing in the marketplace or in the temple, standing and praying loud and long, that people will just be amazed at their ability to communicate with God in that way. And Jesus didn't have any respect for it all. You know, he only says one thing here that's a real kind of the crime part of it. They devour widows' houses. And so they're hypocrites. They're making a show. They're wearing clothing that gets attention. They're sitting in the best seats and all that. But they don't care about justice. And this was a problem way back in the time of Isaiah and Jeremiah in Israel, where they would, the priests, oh my goodness, God said that the priest's table are full of vomit because the priests are getting drunk and throwing up on the table, and they're not concerned with justice. They're bribing judges. They're taking bribes. God was just sick of it. And this seems to go on in societies. It goes on here in America, and I am. So, you wish there was something you could do. But there are people who have been horribly victimized and have no justice, and nobody's looking to give them justice. people run campaigns on the idea of protecting victims, and then they cover it up. And this was going on here, and these scribes were part of it. And Jesus was sick of it, and so they might have wanted to smooth it over, but he was going to point it out. And he warned his disciples, beware of them. Don't fall for it. What they're doing here, don't fall for it. Beware of them. He wanted people with a true heart toward him, and that cared about justice, mercy, love. And so these devour widows' houses, and for a show make long prayers, the same shall receive greater damnation. What do you think he means, greater damnation?
If they're in hell, they'll be more
There are
punishment.
different degrees of punishment for those who know more and reject will get a greater punishment than those that know less.
Yeah, they are scholars of the law. These are the ones rewriting the law. So they know it. They know it. And the Lord says that if you're held accountable for what you know, and there are those who do things wrong that they don't really know as much, and they'll be guilty, but they'll be beaten with few stripes, the Bible says. But those who know will be beaten with many stripes. And so there are degrees of punishments, and he's saying that these who hold themselves out as religious leaders and who know the law and then destroy widows' households and don't look to justice and take bribes and all these things, they're going to receive greater punishment. And I wonder how that made them feel. Because when he said destroy widows' houses, they must have known immediately what they were doing. It really brought it, but maybe more than that, they knew that he knew. There are a lot of people that didn't know. They'd look to them and they'd greet them in the markets and all that, but he just pointed out what they're doing. And I can't help but think the conviction must have been sharp for them at that moment.
We were using God's house, God's word, God's for profit and power. So it was a power structure.
Right.
The widow's houses, they were taking the money and everything, contributing toward the temple,
Yep.
making them richer and more powerful, while they died off for nothing.
While they struggled, and that's right. Yes.
I kind of disagree. I believe unbelievers don't even think about what God thinks about anything. I think they think they're above God,
Mm-hmm.
and they give no thought to what they're doing, that they just do it because they think they're better than God.
Mm-hmm.
I think they don't take it to heart at all. I don't think they feel rejected. I don't think they feel remorse. I think there are people that have no conscience.
Yeah, I think there are some, and the Bible talks about some whose conscience has been seared with a hot iron, and they get to that point where nothing will affect them.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there are others that when Stephen preached, they were cut to the heart. So you do have both.
Yes.
And maybe there was a mix of both in this crowd, or you could be right. Maybe every single one of them had their conscience seared and didn't care.
I don't know, I just know that there are people, no matter what you say to them, they don't care.
Mm-hmm.
They just have they're empty inside.
Yeah.
They're just empty.
Yeah, the Bible does talk about some like that. And it is conjecture. When I bring up these, I'm thinking probably some of them were cut to the heart, but it's conjecture.
Yeah.
It doesn't. The Bible doesn't tell us.
No.
And so it could be a mix, could be one way or the other.
That doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you give up your witness or preaching or studying God's word. It doesn't mean to give up. It just means that there are some.
Well, and we don't know. I would say that some appear to be beyond feeling, and then something big enough happens, and you realize it was a front to protect against that kind of, those kind of things.
I think we need to be careful to label somebody that's beyond something.
Yeah, there was a guy I worked with, or was going to be working with. I worked at a hotel, and they were going to bring in this other guy, and they warned me. They said he's really gruff, and I would witness to him. He was gruff. He had a brick exterior, but I did witness to him and shared the gospel, and then someone else got to lead him to the Lord. I was very, very happy that he came to the Lord during the time I knew him, but we not being able to see the heart, like you said, you don't ever give up, and you just kind of assume everyone's lost and share the gospel with them and keep on to the extent you can.
You planted seeds. Somebody else watered, but you planted seeds.
Right.
Seeds are important.
Yeah, each part is important. God, of course, giving the increase. So Jesus, man, for a man who had a price on his head, and he knew they sought to kill him, he sure didn't do much to help his case for living on, right? But we know that wasn't his purpose, and he knew his mission, and so it was time just to call it out. And that is, there are a lot of people today who don't know much about the Bible, who see Jesus as a hippie type that just peace, love, and just love your neighbor, and he was always meek and kind. Okay, he was, but my goodness, he could also just call it right out, like this. So, we shouldn't ever. We should strive against simplifying him down to just a couple of traits. He was a man and God, and he had a wide range of things he did and said. But one thing we also see is that he was a lot more harsh with those who claimed, who used his name and God's name to do evil than those who were ignorantly doing evil. He was much more harsh when they were religious and knew better.
And I think, as you pointed out, this is getting closer to his life being done on earth. And so he's starting to, not that he wasn't bold before, but he's being more outspoken, at least to his disciples. Hey, be careful this, be careful that. This is happening because I got to leave here pretty soon.
Yeah.
But you need to be aware that this is happening. And also, we're seeing this transition too, where the Israelites are plugging their ears. And so there's a lot more transition period to the Jews here.
Yeah.
The church.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. The Jews in general, where maybe at first there was some curiosity and listening, and some would come and accept him. Now we're getting to a point where the people kind of know what he's about, and they don't want to hear it. They plug their ears. They don't want to hear from him. They want to kill him. Any other comments on chapter 20? Okay, Luke 21, big prophecy chapter. So, verse 1, it says, "And he looked up and saw the rich men casting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw also a certain poor widow casting in thither 2 mites. And he said, Of a truth I say unto you, that this poor widow hath cast in more than they all. For all of these have of their abundance cast in unto the offerings of God. But she of her penury hath cast in all the living that she had." This widow coming to the temple that day probably could have had no idea that she'd be written in stone, her act, for everybody else to read about. So God, we see here then, doesn't just care about quantity or number, but he cares about proportion. And there were a lot of people, and there was a tendency, apparently in that time, for people to come and fling the coins in, so it was really loud, and people were like, "Oh, look, he's giving a lot," and ping, 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 or whatever it is. Well, she came in, and she only gave 2 mites. I think a mite might have been 1/8 of a penny. I mean, this is just, it's really nothing. It is, and for those rich people who were giving, they could have dropped mites on the ground and not reached down to pick them up. But she gave 2 mites. That wasn't going to make a big difference in the treasury, except that when we give, God multiplies it as he wills. And we've seen it here many, many times. You've seen it in your own life, I hope and pray, that when you give, God multiplies it. He both multiplies it in the receiving, so the church, there are times when the church didn't have much, and yet it continued on. There are times when we give, special offerings are needed, and we give, and then more floods in, and it's amazing. We've seen in even faith promise giving, faith hope giving, where you just set an amount and say, "I'm going to give this much to the Lord," not knowing how you're going to get it, and you get it, and you give it. I've told the story many times about the business owner who, this was in the 80s and 90s. He started realizing that 10% just didn't feel enough, and he bumped it to 15, and then 20, 25, and before it was over, he was giving 80% of his income and still making it. God uses us as we put our faith in him. And but this woman gave everything. She didn't have reserves. It's one thing to give when you have reserves, and you know that you got something, if times get tough. She gave everything she had of her substance. Yes.
Yeah, I think this is just, it was a matter of the condition, not of her purse, but of her heart.
Yeah. It's a matter of her heart. And she gave it all, completely putting her dependence in the Lord. And it does, it makes me think back to Elijah. I don't remember. I can usually remember if the assistant is involved in the story, because Elijah's, not assistant, what do you call him? Student? And then Gehazi is Elisha's. But anyway, I think it was Elijah. Yeah, because it was right after being at the brook and being fed by ravens, and then he went to the woman's house. And this wasn't in Israel, right? He went out of Israel to go to this widow, and he says, would you please make me a cake? And she says, well, this is it. I'm going home. I'm going to make just one little cake for me and my son, and we're done, because that's it. It's gone. And he says, okay, but make one for me first. And, okay, so she agreed. That'd be a hard thing, but she had faith in the man of God, the God of Israel. And she makes this cake for him first, and boy, I bet she thought that was a good move. I'm glad I did that, because it would have been it. But she made it for him first, and then her cruises of oil never gave out. And so, and everyone knew it. Everyone in town sees this woman who's about to die, and because of this man of God. So there are these accounts given in Scripture where someone was hanging by a thread and gave. We also know, okay, go ahead.
When you mentioned that, I had just studied that not long ago. I don't know if it was Brother Anthony or private study, but God sent her directly to her. He could have sent her to anyone, but he sent her.
He sent him, right? Him to her.
Elijah directly to that specific widow.
Yes.
So God was in control.
That's right.
And then the thing I noticed too, we go up a couple of verses, and you just mentioned about him saying, which devour widows. And then we're talking about a widow giving her all.
Yes.
I never connected those
I didn't really either.
until just now.
Right. So he just mentioned that they devour widows' houses. Maybe this is a woman who'd been taken advantage of by them. Could be that they had the rest of her house, and she's down to this. There are accounts of this given, and we know, was it the Macedonians that gave of their poverty? There were some who gave, and Paul was commending them, but he said, man, there are many who gave of their abundance, but these gave beyond what they had. They gave above what they had. And I think it was the Macedonians. But Monday night, I was just trying to remember this again, and I figured it out, and now I can't remember. But is it 16? Yeah. 1 Corinthians 16. Yeah, 16. Now concerning the collection. Liberality. Macedonia. I don't see it. Maybe it's in second. But anyway, so God sees the heart. He sees the willingness to give, and then He protects. So of course there is a way that we can foolishly use up our substance. We can be foolish with our money, but if we're giving to the Lord and His work, He seems to watch over that. Yes.
I have that verse, it's 2 Corinthians 8:2, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality.
Yeah. Yeah. Did it say who it was?
Let me go back, I just looked up the verse and it's by itself. Macedonia.
Macedonia.
Churches of Macedonia.
Okay. So they gave above what they had, which is, I've done before as well. You promise to give and you don't even know how it's going to get there and you don't have it, and then a check comes in or you find money in your pocket or whatever it is. the Lord, he actually says to try him in it. Try me and see. Give, and it shall be given unto you. Pressed down, shaken together. Running over, will the Lord cause men to give unto your bosom. So, he wants us to try him. And it strengthens our faith, and it allows him to do more through us. And so, back in Luke, you have this woman, and she might have been one of the very ones taken advantage of by the scribes, but she gave, and he noted it, and he said she gave more than the rest of them because she gave all she had. So he's looking at proportion. We'll look at verse 5. And as some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said, as for these things which ye behold, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be? And what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? Okay, so before we go into this, I want to note that it is prophecy. He's talking about what's going to come. But as I've said many times, that with prophecy, a prophet can be speaking and speak about a number of things, and maybe 3 of them are going to happen in 20 years, and the other 4 aren't going to happen for 2,000 years. And there's not much of a difference in the way they speak. They just say it. Here it is. This is what's going to happen. And some could be very near term, and some can be very, very far off in the distance. And so it is with this passage. And also some things can happen in a limited way, and the same thing happen in a bigger way down the road. And so verse 8, and he said, take heed that ye be not deceived, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ. And the time draweth near, go ye not therefore after them. So he warns, before he even tells them what will be the sign of this coming and what will be the indicators of the times, he says, before that, let me tell you, there are going to be a lot of people that come in my name. And they're going to come and they're going to say, I am Christ. And he says, don't go after them. Don't be deceived by them. There are those he's talking to who know him. And if someone else came in his name, they would know. But he's also speaking to us. We can know him as well by reading his word. You ever hear, a year ago or so, there was a guy who came out and had a bunch of ads on social media saying he was the new Messiah, and he was starting a new following, and there were people who were committing their lives to him and all this. But have you ever heard from any prophets in your lifetime that claim to be the Christ? I know you know of David Koresh, and there are others. But when you read or listen to them, they might start out sounding okay, but it doesn't take very long for us to know this isn't a man of God. It does not take long if you know the scriptures, and if you know God, you know Jesus. It's funny, there are a lot of people out there that read superficially or sing Christian songs occasionally, and read this, and they're taken by these people. But with a little deeper study, you can sniff them out very easily. And so he says, there are going to be those who come in my name. There are going to be those who say, I am Christ. Do not go after them. I'm just going to read one more little bit here, and we'll be done. Verse number 9, Luke 21:9. But when ye shall hear of wars and commotions, be not terrified, for these things must first come to pass, but the end is not by and by. There's a thought that when you hear of wars and rumors of wars and all this, that the end is there. He says it's not yet. You're going to have more of these. You're going to have more of this before the end. Then he said, verse 10, then he said unto them, nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines and pestilences, and fearful sights, and great signs shall there be from heaven. But before all these, they shall lay their hands on you. So he's talking for a moment there about these great things that are going to happen, which will signify the beginning of trouble, beginning of sorrows. The end is not yet. I mean, there's more to come after that. But he says, before all that, they're going to take you, lay their hands on you, and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. So there are things going to happen, but sooner than that, you're going to face a lot of things. And he warns them to be strong, be ready, don't worry or think about what they're going to say. God will give them the words to say when it's time. Well, we're out of time, so again, please read Luke 21 and Matthew 24, and we'll discuss it further next time.